The night my husband died, his brother did not cry. He counted. I stood in the doorway of the room where Obinna's body lay still, warm, under a white cloth, and I watched Kelechi walk past the mourners, past his own weeping mother, straight to the cabinet where my husband kept his documents. He did not look at me. He did not look at the children clinging to my wrapper. He opened that cabinet like a man who already knew what he was looking for, and when he found the land papers, he smiled, a small, private smile. The kind of smile a man wears when a plan he has waited years for finally begins to move. I should have screamed then. I should have thrown myself at him and torn that smile from his face, but grief had taken my voice, and so I only watched, my chest hollow, as my husband's brother folded those papers into his jacket and walked out into the rain without saying a single word of comfort to me or to my 3 children. That was the beginning, but it was not the beginning of his betrayal. That had started long before, in rooms I was never invited into, in conversations I was never told about, in a silence that had been building for 9 years like termites eating the inside of a house while the outside still looks strong. My name is Adaeze. I will tell you what happened in my house, in my family, in the village of Umoji, where everybody smiles at you in the morning and stabs your name in the evening. I will tell you about my husband's brother, who claimed my children as his own property the week we buried their father. I will tell you about my mother-in-law, Neogoma, who stood beside him and called it tradition, called it culture, called it love, when it was none of those things. It was hunger. It was a hunger that had been growing inside that family since before I ever stepped into it, and I was only now beginning to see its teeth. Let me take you back. 3 years before Obinna died, before the cabinet, before the rain, there was a wedding. Not mine. My husband's younger cousin, Chinwe, was getting married, and the whole family gathered in our compound the night before to cook and gossip and pretend to be one happy bloodline. I remember Nell Goma pulling me aside that night, her fingers gripping my wrist tighter than necessary, and saying, "Adaeze, a woman without sons is a woman standing on sand." I had 2 daughters then. My son, Chidera, had not yet been born. I smiled at her the way you smile at an insult wrapped in a proverb, and I said nothing, because in that family, silence was the only armor a daughter-in-law was given. I did not know that night that Kelechi was already watching me the way a hawk watches a hen it has decided will one day be its own. I did not know that he had already begun speaking to elders in the village quietly about what would happen to Obinna's property if Obinna died without a son. I did not know my husband's own brother had begun building a case against my family before my son was even conceived. When Chidera was born 2 years later, I thought the prophecy of my mother-in-law's bitterness had been silenced. I was wrong. It only changed shape, because now, instead of a woman with no sons, I had become a woman whose son Kelechi believed should have been his. You see, what I did not know, what nobody told me until the funeral itself, was that Kelechi had once been engaged to me, before Obinna, before any of this. It was arranged when I was 19, a quiet understanding between our fathers, broken off when Kelechi traveled to Port Harcourt for work and returned 2 years later to find that his own older brother, Obinna, had fallen in love with the same woman his family had chosen for him and had married her instead while he was away. Nobody ever told me this, not Obinna, not his mother. I learnt it from an old aunt during the 7 days of mourning, an aunt who had drank too much palm wine and could no longer hold her tongue. She looked at me with pity and said, "You never knew? Kelechi has hated his brother since the day Obinna took what was promised to him." And just like that, the floor of my understanding cracked open, and I began falling through 9 years of marriage I thought I understood, realizing I had only ever seen the surface of it. Suddenly, every cold glance Kelechi had given me at family gatherings made sense. Every time he refused to eat food I cooked unless his mother tasted it first. Every joke that wasn't really a joke. Every comment about how some men marry quickly because they are afraid to lose what isn't theirs. It wasn't envy of Obinna's success. It was the wound of a man who believed his own brother stole his future and who had spent a decade waiting for an opportunity to take it back. And Obinna, my husband, my quiet, gentle Obinna, had known. He had known the whole time and said nothing to protect me. Was that love, to shield me from a truth that might frighten me? Or was it cowardice, building our home on a foundation he knew was cracked, hoping the crack would never reach the surface? I will let you decide, because even now, even after everything, I am not certain myself. The funeral lasted 7 days as is tradition. By the third day, Kelechi was no longer hiding his intentions behind smiles. He called a family meeting in the compound, without consulting me, without even informing me until 30 minutes before it began, and announced, in front of uncles and elders and his weeping mother, that as the eldest surviving brother, he was now the head of Obinna's household. That meant, he said, looking directly at my children as if they were furniture being inventoried, that the children belonged under his guardianship according to our custom. I stood and said the only thing my burning throat could form. These are my children. I carried them. I fed them from my own body. No custom gives you the right to call them yours.
The room went still. In that particular way, rooms go still in our villages. Not because people agree with you, but because they are waiting to see who will be brave enough or foolish enough to speak next. It was Neogoma who spoke, my mother-in-law. The woman who had once held my hand at Chidera's naming ceremony and called me the daughter my own womb forgot to give me. She rose slowly, leaning on her whopping stick, and said words that I will carry in my chest until the day I die. Adaeze, you are a wife. Wives leave, blood remains. These children are Eze blood, and Eze blood must be raised by Eze hands. If you fight this, you will leave this compound with nothing, not even the clothes on those children's backs. I want you to imagine that moment. A widow, 7 days into her grief, still smelling her husband's burial cloth on her own skin, being told by the mother of that very husband that her children were not truly hers, that motherhood itself could be erased by a custom invoked at the convenient hour. But here is where the story takes its first true turn, the kind you will not expect. That night, after the elders left and the compound grew quiet, except for the crickets, and my daughter's frightened breathing as they slept pressed against me, an old woman came to my window. Not through the gate, through the back path that only people born in that compound would know existed. It was Mama Kelechi, Obinna's father's younger sister, a woman the family rarely spoke of because she had married outside the village and was considered, in their words, spoiled by the city. She did not waste time on comfort. She said, Adaeze, listen to me carefully because I will only say this once. Kelechi is not fighting for tradition. He is fighting for the land registered in Obinna's name in Port Harcourt. 3 plots, bought before you ever married him, before anyone in this family even knew Obinna had money. If Kelechi controls the children, under the law, he can argue guardianship over their inheritance until they are adults. He does not want your children, he wants what your children will one day own. I felt my body go cold in the heat of that room. 3 plots of land, my husband, quiet, humble Obinna, who drove an old Peugeot and wore the same 3 shirts in rotation for years, had secretly owned land worth more than this entire compound and never told me. Why would he hide that from me? I asked, my voice breaking. Mama Nkechi's eyes softened, but only slightly. Adaeze, Kelechi already tried to take it once, 8 years ago, before you had your first daughter. Obinna caught him forging signatures on a transfer document. They fought. Obinna won that fight quietly by simply not telling anyone, not even you, where the real documents were kept. He thought silence was safety. He was wrong. Now that he is dead, the silence has become a weapon his brother can finally use against you. If you're starting to feel your heart race the way mine did that night, that's exactly the kind of story we share here. So if no one has told you yet today, subscribe, because what comes next will shake you even more. I did not sleep after Mama Nkechi left through that same back path she had come from. I sat on the edge of the bed I had shared with Obinna for 9 years, staring at the wardrobe where his shirts were still hanging, pressed and waiting for a man who would never wear them again. And I asked myself a question that frightened me more than Kelechi's threats ever had. How well had I truly known my own husband? I went through his things that night, quietly, so the children would not wake. In the bottom of an old tin box he kept under loose floorboards, a box I had always assumed held nothing more than expired documents and old photographs, I found a second letter. Not the formal one filed with his will, a personal one, written to me directly, dated barely 3 months before his death, as though some part of him had sensed his time was running short. In it, Obinna wrote about a recurring chest pain he had never told me about, dismissed by a local chemist as stress without ever seeing a proper doctor. He wrote that he suspected something was wrong with his heart, the same illness that had quietly taken his own father at 53, and that he was too afraid to confirm it, because confirming it would mean admitting he might leave us unprepared. He wrote that he had been securing the land document and finalizing the will, not out of paranoia, but because some part of him already knew his time with us was limited, and he wanted to make sure that whatever silence surrounded his death, the truth of our ownership would not die with him. I sat with that letter pressed against my chest until the sun rose, weeping in a way I had not allowed myself to weep even at his funeral, not for the man I thought I had lost, but for the frightened, dying man I never knew I was living beside, who spent his final months protecting a future he would never get to see. It changed something in me. The anger I carried toward Kelechi did not disappear, but it sharpened into something colder, more focused. I was no longer simply defending my children from a greedy uncle. I was finishing a fight my husband had started in secret, alone, while dying quietly beside a wife who never noticed the signs because he had hidden them so carefully. The following morning, I confronted Kelechi alone, away from his mother's ears. I told him I knew about the land. I watched his face, and here is the second twist, the one that changed everything I thought I understood about this man. He did not look guilty. He looked relieved.
"Finally," he said, sitting down heavily on the bench outside the barn. "Someone in this family is willing to say it out loud." And then, in a voice stripped of all the venom I had expected, he told me his own secret, the one even his mother did not know. Kelechi was drowning in debt. Not small debt, the kind that men hide with smiles and borrowed cars and rented suits at weddings. He had invested in a transport business with a friend who disappeared with the money 2 years prior, and creditors, dangerous men, the kind who do not wait politely for repayment, were threatening his family, his wife, his own 2 sons. "I am not trying to steal from your children to be cruel," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard him before. "I am trying to survive. Obinna would have helped me if he were alive. He always helped me, but he is gone and I have nowhere else to turn." For a moment, just a moment, I felt something dangerously close to sympathy. This is the trap grief sets for us. It makes us forget that a man's pain does not excuse the harm he plans to commit with it. I reminded myself of my daughter's faces the night Neugoma threatened to take them from me, and I hardened my voice. "You will not touch what belongs to my children," I told him. "Whatever you owe, it is not their burden to carry." He stood then, and the softness vanished from his face as quickly as it had come. "Then we will see, in front of the elders, whose name carries more weight in this family, a widow's or a son's." That, dear listener, was when I understood that this would not be settled with conversation. It would be settled with proof, with documents, with a fight I had never trained for but would now have to win. The days that followed were a blur of secret movements. I traveled to Port Harcourt with Mama Nkechi, claiming to visit a sick relative, when in truth,
We went to the land registry office to confirm what she had told me. The clerk, an elderly man who remembered Obinna fondly, such a quiet, careful man, he said, shaking his head with something like grief, confirmed that the 3 plots were registered solely under Obinna's name, with a clause naming his children, not his brother, as beneficiaries in the event of his death. There was also something else, a 4th document, a will, filed quietly 2 years before his death, I never knew existed. I asked the clerk if I could see it. He hesitated. These things require process, he said, but something in my face, some desperation he must have recognized from other widows who had sat in that same chair before me, made him slide the folder toward me anyway. What I read in that will broke something in me that I am still trying to repair, even now as I tell you this story. Obinna had written in his own hand a letter meant to be read only after his death. In it, he confessed that he had always known about Kelechi's resentment, about the broken engagement, about the years of quiet hostility disguised as brotherly teasing. He wrote that he had married me not only out of love, but partly out of guilt, because he had seen the way his brother looked at me before he himself ever spoke to me, and some small, ashamed part of him had wanted, just once in his life, to take something for himself before his older brother privileges were handed away to someone else, the way they always were in that family. I want you to sit with that for a moment, the way I had to sit with it in that registry office, surrounded by strangers who had no idea they were witnessing the unraveling of a marriage from beyond the grave. My husband, the man I grieved as a saint for 7 days, confessed in his own handwriting that some part of our love story began as an act of rebellion against his brother, not purely because he loved me, but because loving me was also a way of winning. Did that make our marriage a lie? I asked myself this on the long drive home, watching the red dust of the road rise behind Mama Nkechi's car. I do not think it did. People can love you fully and also love you for complicated, selfish reasons buried underneath the simple ones. Obinna's letter went on to say that whatever began as rivalry had transformed over the years into something real, that he had come to love me not because I was something to be won, but because I was someone worth keeping. He wrote that he was sorry for never telling me the truth and that he had protected the land in our children's names specifically because he feared that one day, after he was gone, his brother's old resentment would resurface and try to consume what we had built. He had seen this coming. He had prepared a shield. He simply never told me where he kept it. If you've ever discovered something about someone you loved that changed how you saw your whole life together, you understand exactly what I felt in that car. And if this story is already keeping you on the edge of your seat, that's the whole point. So stay with me, because the elders' meeting was still ahead of us, and it would not go the way anyone expected. We returned to the village 3 days before the meeting Kelechi had demanded with the elders. In that time, something else happened, something that complicated the story even more, the way real life always complicates the stories we tell about it. My eldest daughter, Ifeoma, only 11 years old, came to me one evening with tears in her eyes and told me that Neogoma had been speaking to her secretly, telling her that if she wanted to stay in her father's house and not be thrown out like rubbish by her mother's village family, she should tell the elders that she wanted to live with Uncle Kelechi. My own mother-in-law, coaching my own child to betray me, manipulating a grieving 11-year-old's fear of homelessness to win a case about land she would never personally benefit from. I confronted Nelgoma that same night, my voice shaking with a fury I had never allowed myself before in that household. How could you do this to a child, your own grandchild? And here is the moment, dear listener, where the story shifted one final time. The twist I did not see coming even after everything else I had already learned. Nelgoma sat down slowly, the fight draining out of her old body, and told me something I will never forget. Adaeze, you think I support Kelechi because I believe in this custom of his. I do not. I support him because 30 years ago, his father did the exact same thing to me. She told me, voice trembling, that when her own husband died, his brothers had tried to claim her children, claim her land, claim everything she had built, simply because she was only a wife. She had fought them for 2 years, lost most of the family's property, and survived only because a single elder took pity on her and intervened. She says she had watched her own sons grow up poor because of that fight, and somewhere in the bitterness of those years, she had convinced herself that the only way to protect a family's wealth was to make sure it stayed entirely within the bloodline, controlled by sons, never trusted to a widow who could leave or be taken advantage of. I am not doing this because I hate you, she said, tears finally falling down her wrinkled face. I am doing this because I am afraid for you, in my own twisted way. I thought Kelechi controlled things no outsider could ever take it from this family again. I did not think about what it would cost your children to feel unclaimed by their own mother. I was wrong, Adaeze. I have been wrong for years, and I did not know how to admit it until tonight. I sat with that confession in silence for a long time. Here was a woman whose cruelty I had hated for 9 years, revealed not as a monster, but a survivor of her own old wound, repeating the very harm that had been done to her, convinced she was protecting her grandchildren by destroying their mother. There are no easy villains in real families. Only people carrying wounds so old they forget the wounds are even there until the wounds start bleeding onto someone else. The elders' meeting came on a humid afternoon. The whole compound gathered under the old udara tree, where every important decision in that family had been made for generations. I brought the will, I brought the land documents, I brought the truth about Kelechi's debts, which Mama Nkechi had quietly confirmed through her own contacts in Port Harcourt. And tucked inside my wrapper, against my chest, I carried the second letter, the private one, the one that was never meant for anyone's eyes but mine, because I had decided in the quiet hours before dawn that some truths are too sacred to be used as weapons, even in a war you are desperate to win. Before the meeting began, something happened that I did not plan for and could not have predicted. Chinwe, the same cousin whose wedding had started this entire chain of events 3 years earlier, arrived uninvited, breathless from running, and asked to speak before the elders made their decision. The compound murmured in confusion. Chinwe was not a party to this dispute. She had no land at stake, no children being contested, but she stood in front of everyone, hands trembling, and revealed something that none of us, not even Nelgoma, had known. Chinwe confessed that 2 years ago, Kelechi had approached her husband privately, asking to borrow money against the promise that he would soon control significant family property and could repay double once that property was settled. Her husband had refused, suspicious of the vague promise, but had mentioned it to Chinwe in passing, never thinking it would matter. She had stayed silent about it for 2 years, not wanting to stir family conflict over something that seemed, at the time, like empty boasting from a man under pressure. I am only speaking now, Chinwe said, her voice shaking, because I did not understand until I saw what was happening to Adaeze, that Kelechi was not boasting, he was planning. He knew even then that Obinna's land would one day be the answer to his debts, and he was simply waiting for the right moment to act. The compound erupted into murmurs and accusations, uncles shouting over each other, Nelgoma's face draining of color as she finally understood the timeline of her son's deception stretched back farther than even she had assumed. Kelechi tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, but the damage to his credibility was already done. And when the head elder, Adaeze Okonkwo, finally called for silence and asked to see the document I had brought, the room listened with an entirely different weight than it would have an hour before. He read the will aloud, slowly, deliberately, the way elders read things meant to be remembered. When he reached the part where Obinna confessed his old fears about his brother's resentment, written years before any of us could have staged this moment, the compound fell into the kind of silence that exists only in the presence of undeniable truth. Kelechi broke first. He stood, his hands shaking, and confessed everything in front of the elders, the debts, the creditors, the desperation that had nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with survivor. He wept, this man who had not cried even at his own brother's funeral, and admitted that he had let an old wound from his youth convince it was acceptable to threaten his dead brother's children to save himself. I will tell you honestly, because I promised myself I would tell this story without pretending to be a perfect woman in it. I almost forgave him in that moment. Almost. Grief does strange things to anger. But then I looked at my children sitting frightened beside me, and I remembered that forgiveness and protection are not always the same decision. The elders ruled finally that the land and the children's guardianship would remain solely with me, as written in Obinna's will, with Mama Nkechi appointed as an outside witness to ensure no further tampering occurred. Kelechi was given nothing from the estate, though several elders,
moved by his confession, quietly agreed among themselves to help him negotiate with his creditors separately, as an act of mercy rather than entitlement. It was not a clean victory, I want you to understand that, because life rarely gives us clean victories. Neogoma and I did not return to the warmth we once pretended to share. Something had broken between us, that honesty once spoken could not fully repair, even though I understood her now, even though I no longer hated her the way I once did. Understanding someone's wound does not always heal the scar they left on you. Kelechi disappeared from the village for almost a year after that meeting, too ashamed to face his family. His debts eventually settled through means I never fully learned and did not ask about. When he finally returned, thinner and quieter, he came to my house alone one evening and asked simply to see his nephew and nieces. I let him, not because I trusted him fully again. I do not think I ever will completely, but because I had learned through all of this that children deserve the chance to know their family beyond the worst things their family has done. As for me, I rebuilt my life slowly, on land that was always rightfully my children's, in a house that finally felt like mine rather than something borrowed from a husband's memory. I think of Obinna often, not as the saint I grieved in those first 7 days, nor as the secretly resentful man revealed in his letter, but as something more complicated and more human than either. A man who loved imperfectly, protected imperfectly, and left me in the end with both a wound and a shield tangled together in the same handwriting. There is one more thing I must tell you, because I promised you a story without easy endings, and this part still unsettles me whenever I think of it. 2 years after the elders' ruling, Kelechi came to me again, not for money this time, and not for land. He came to tell me that his own son, my children's cousin, had been diagnosed with the same heart condition that had quietly taken both his father and Obinna before him. He sat in my parlor, this man I had once watched fold my dying husband's land documents into his jacket without a word of comfort, and wept like a child himself, asking if he knew anything about the illness, anything Obinna might have mentioned, anything that could save his son where it had failed to save his brother. I gave him what I knew. I gave him the name of the doctor in Port Harcourt who finally, after Obinna's death, helped me understand what we had missed. I did this not because the years erased what Kelechi tried to do to my children, but because I had learned something in that long, painful season of my life, that refusing a dying child his only chance simply to punish a father's past sins would have made me into exactly the kind of person I had spent 2 years fighting against. Cruelty does not heal a wound. It only passes the wound forward, the way Neogoma had passed hers down without even realizing she was doing it. Some endings are not victories wrapped in ribbon. Some endings are simply survival, carried forward with open eyes, and the slow, uneven work of choosing not to become the very thing that almost destroyed you. I did not get back the family I believed I had for 9 years. I got instead the truth of what that family actually was: flawed, frightened, capable of both cruelty and quiet redemption. And I learned to build something steadier on top of that truth than I ever could have built on the comfortable lie that came before it. My daughters are older now. Ifeoma no longer remembers, or pretend not to remember, the night her own grandmother tried to turn her against me. My son, Chidera, carries his father's land papers in a small file I will hand to him fully when he is grown, along with both letters, the public one and the private one, so that he will understand, the way I eventually did, that the people we love are rarely as simple as the roles we assign them: husband, brother, mother, villain, saint. Real people slide between all of these in a single lifetime, sometimes in a single year, sometimes in the space of a single confession beneath an old udara tree. If this story moved something in you, the way it still moves something in me every time I tell it, leave a comment and let me know which part shocked you the most. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories where the people we trust most are not always who we believe them to be, and where the truth, however painful, is always the only real foundation worth standing on. This has been the story of my husband's brother who claimed my children and the mother-in-law who supported him, until the truth came, slowly, in pieces, and changed everything.